I'm Marie Harvey, Associate Dean for Research in the College of Health, and pleased to see you here today at the College Research Seminar. We have a wonderful speaker, and I think what I want to do is quickly introduce Carrie Lynn Sakuma, who is Associate Professor in the Health Promotion Health Behavior Program here, and she is, this seminar is being co-sponsored, co-hosted by that program. And she is here to introduce our speaker and moderate the seminar. So Carrie Lynn, take it away. We need to use this so people on Zoom can. Yep.
For you. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming for the Friday Research Seminar. We're so glad that you can be here. There are people in the room, and those of you who are joining us on Zoom, thank you for being here. We do want to ask that those of you who are online, if you could ask your questions using the question and answer mechanism through Zoom, we would really appreciate that. We will ask the question out loud in the room when the time comes. So hopefully people are all accustomed to that one. But without further ado, I was asked to give a very simple introduction to our guest. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Jill Hoxmeier, which is kind of like a homecoming for her, I think. Getting her PhD here at the college, what was formerly known as the College of Health and Human Sciences, Public Health and Human Sciences. But Jill is also one of our very beloved instructors for the Health Promotion and Health Behavior Program and the MPH Public Health Practice Program. Currently serving as interim program director for that program. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Jill.
Okay, we get that sorted. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. It is a homecoming. I love it being back. I am always grateful for the opportunity to talk about my research and sexual violence more broadly. It is not always a topic that draws a crowd. And my work, I hope, is really about, having these conversations, talking about bystander intervention, but we're, really all bystanders. In our own ways. And so this is the title of my presentation, or as I like to say, what I talk about when I talk about bystander intervention. So rather than focusing on one study today, I thought I would share a little bit about really the evolution in bystander intervention measures. Measurement is what I've spent the last several years really focusing on, and talk about how my research has fit into that and what we all hope to do, right, as scholars to nudge it a little bit along. So research in this area is pretty dynamic, which is what I love about it. As mentioned, I started my work here in bystander intervention using the theory of planned behavior to look at correlates. Of course, I probably said influences, and a lot of us who are doing cross-sectional work will look at influences, but they're correlates, right, of intervention behavior. But at the time, I was really under the impression that we had the behavioral outcomes, bystander intervention behaviors, those measures pretty dialed. It quickly came to my realization that was not the case. And so that is what I have spent a lot of time looking at, the measures specifically. So, and of course, in my work, I always try and bring a public health perspective to this body of research, because many people talk about bystander intervention as primary prevention. And so in my work, I always try and remind us that in order to fulfill that, we need to be, it means we need to differentiate between when people are intervening across the spectrum of violence. I'll talk about that a little bit more, from pre-assault to post-assault, as well as intervening with potential or actual perpetrators of violence versus potential or actual victims or survivors of violence. So I wanted to start with some pretty broad considerations just to orient us to bystander intervention. measurement in the field specifically. So I have looked at bystander intention, the likeliness that I would intervene if I had the opportunity to do so, as well as self-reported past actions. And I think we can all make a list of the challenges, asking people to draw on past experiences and past reported intervention behavior. And many of us do one or the other. And so the extent to which intentions are a good proxy for behavior is, I would say, questionable at best. But my work has really focused on quantifying these complex experiences, what we consider to be pretty complex experiences, and often relying on self-reported past intervention actions. So there's a wide range of opportunities that students, I study specifically students, people have to intervene, but students specifically, a wide range across that spectrum, of course, from interrupting situations that could lead to violence before it happens, mid-assault to post-assault, support of those who disclose victimization, for example. And generally, we are measuring bystander behavior relative to opportunity. So different than some other health-related behaviors, people can only intervene if they have the opportunity to do so. Whereas with exercise or dietary behaviors, we just kind of assume that people have the opportunity. They do it. But this adds, of course, a layer of complexity, often with the analysis, right? Is that differentiating non-interveners from I had the opportunity and I didn't take action compared to I didn't take action, but I never had an opportunity to do it. So a little bit complex in that sense. So, and then finally, and perhaps most interestingly, bystander intervention models for prevention really assumes that intervening is helpful, despite little investigation into whether that is true. Okay, so hopefully less walk down memory lane and more just, again, kind of orienting to this evolution of my work. So as I mentioned, I started my work using the theory of planned behavior to look at differences between interveners and non-interveners. Because a lot of work at the time was trying to understand influences. Why are people intervening? So the theory of planned behavior, of course, perceived self-efficacy, perceived behavioral control, whether or not I feel intervening is easy or not, my confidence in order to intervene, social norms, my perception that my peers would approve or disapprove of my intervening in these situations, and attitudes, the extent to which I think intervening is helpful. And so this was somewhat new at the time. There weren't really models for looking at influences, kind of drawing on all sorts of constructs from the literature. And so I was looking at 12 risk situations, again, across that spectrum of violence, pre, mid, post, and with potential or actual perpetrators, and with potential or actual victim survivors. So like I said earlier, I quickly became so fascinated by these measures and what are we even measuring as these outcomes of when and how people are intervening. And this 12 situations that I was using was really pared down from these larger scales that had, 40 to 50 opportunities or intervention behaviors that people could intervene in. And how I've kind of come to where I'm at now is really understanding gender differences and the role that men can play in really disrupting the norms that perpetuate violence to begin with. And so I'm always trying to bring the field back around to, are people intervening because they want to save women from dangerous men, or are we interrupting these situations because it reflects a commitment to the social injustices that perpetuate violence to begin with? and really focusing on men because men are more likely to be perpetrators, and they have such power in order to shape the norms to make intervention more acceptable, socially normative. So that's kind of where my work has been most recently. So as I mentioned, those 12 situations, this is just a snippet, and I wanted to put these up here to really illustrate that intervention opportunities are not monolithic. But we often say, bystander intervention or I intervene. And what does that really mean when it can mean a lot of different things? So I just wanted to put these examples up. So whereas most scales, I mentioned some scales with 40 or 50 intervention opportunities and behaviors, collapses down into a composite score. So it doesn't matter where along the spectrum people are intervening or with whom, when, and how. We just create a composite score, a mean score across those 50 situations, or the 12 in my case, into a composite of intervention. But as I mentioned, many scholars, I am not one of them, who refer to bystander intervention as primary prevention because I just don't know if that is true yet. Refer to it as primary prevention. I do feel it's important to really push back on that. When we talk about, and in the literature, people are intervening. So we're preventing violence. But as you can see, the extent to whether or not that is true, when it could be, post-assault support, again, from a public health perspective, tertiary prevention, this can go a long way into mitigating harm associated with victimization. But this is not preventing violence. And perhaps we don't know if this is reflecting a bystander's commitment to, confront the norms that perpetuate violence. So I'm always trying to emphasize that our conclusions about our research are really only as good as our measures are to assess it. So just as those opportunities to intervene are not monolithic, so too are not bystander action. And I hope you can see this. I just pulled this. This is kind of classic practical presentation of how this model has been, given on college campuses and to lesser extent in communities, but communities settings are more adopting this model for prevention. So this is often presented as, look, here you have all these options. These are all the ways that you could intervene: direct, distract, delegate, document, and delay. So again, going back to that primary prevention or even prevention general perspective, we really have to question how that fits into primary prevention when saying I intervene could mean that I delayed, I documented, delegated, and even really distract. And so I like to give this example because I think it's interesting, just like a glimpse into our history of using this model for prevention, that I remember seeing kind of early bystander intervention prevention programming, promoting distraction, and, encouraging or, giving an option of like, someone who's being sexually aggressive, for example, a friend saying, hey, let's go get another drink as a distraction. And I don't want to be a Pollyanna here, but rarely is getting another drink, a solution for anything, least of which, sexually aggressive people. And so just an example of, how this model of the 5 Ds, I believe and fits outside the scope of what we're really trying to do in public health. And so there's been some other really interesting qualitative research looking at men's experiences with past intervention and these situations. What have they done? What do they do? And looking at, participants were talking about kind of more distraction, like, hey, let's go find another person, or, and so you have to question again, like, how does redirecting sexual aggression to another person, how is that reflecting people's, commitment or really understanding of the problematic behavior? So again, in addition to understanding, when people are intervening, I'm also arguing that how people are intervening is a really critical piece of that puzzle. Okay, so following my theory of planned behavior research, again, moving away from those composite scores, I really started focusing on the situation level, which, analytically and with the data, that can be really challenging. In a survey too, it's really hard to get people to commit to, 18-page surveys where you're asking about a number of situations. And so pared down on those 12 situations. And this was a study where my colleagues and I were combining opportunity, action, barriers, all in one measure for just a handful of situations. So, for this one, over 2,500 students said that they had the opportunity to do something when they saw a guy taking a drunk girl back to his room. That was the situation. I think that was, 35% of the sample said they had an opportunity to do this. So you can see when we have to differentiate or when we have to measure behavior relative to opportunity, sample is getting, pretty small just for accounting for people who didn't have the opportunity. So of these people who had this opportunity, 40% said they did nothing because it wasn't any of my business, which we characterize as a failure to take intervention responsibility. And then 13% confronted the situation directly. And you can see binary gender terms. This is kind of changing. I'm glad to be, a little bit a part of that work, but this is very common that we're using binary gender identities and looking at gender identities in this way. So some gender differences, more men than women are reporting that failure to take intervention responsibility. More women compared to men said they didn't do anything because they were unsure what to do, which we characterize as a failure to intervene due to skills deficit. So I was really intrigued by this other category, 11% saying none of these things applied. I did something else or something else contextually was going on. So we followed up with a qualitative study looking at the text entry responses. So it was other, and then they had an opportunity to say what that other was. And so these are some examples of the responses we got. We had 2 items, saw a guy taking a drunk girl back to their room and saw a girl taking a drunk guy. And these are both compiled here just for the sake of brevity. And so we see some examples of some very subjective assessment. As you can see, alcohol played a very big role in the barriers or just people's risk identification. And so even before people can have a skills deficit or not feel responsible for intervening, they have to recognize the situation as one worthy of even intervening. And so we see that there was a lot of examples of people subjectively assessing, how drunk these people are as an indication of, should I intervene or not? And this was really interesting because at the time, we thought these measures for risk situations, we thought we were giving people a risk situation that's pretty cut and dry. That this is something you would intervene in. And we're using the language that should signal to that. And so this was pretty eye-opening, and maybe it shouldn't have been that surprising. It's like, I'm not sure we're even on the same page with students about these situations that we think we're giving them a risk situation that's cut and dry, and their experience of that when they're looking back on their past experience is probably not lining up. So course, this led to another study. So here I was looking specifically at men's experiences as bystanders and really focusing on that idea of risk identification. So this was from focus group data. Men were talking about their opportunities and experiences as bystanders. And what we found was with respect to the clues or the signals that suggested potential for sexual assault, sexual violence, women's use of alcohol was more likely to cue them into something going on as compared to men's use of sexual aggression. And so again, coming back to that public health perspective, this idea of harm reduction is often emphasized, in programming, and there's kind of a push and pull, right? Because we know that alcohol plays a big role in sexual violence risk, but there would be no risk if the sexual aggressor is there. And so it's important to differentiate between, intervention that's harm reduction and intervention that's primary prevention and looking at the risk of the potential perpetrator. So, and I will say that, going back to that gendered notion of violence, that all of their experiences with, thinking back on their past experiences were framed in this way, that it was always a female or woman potential or actual victim and a man in the role of a potential or actual perpetrator. So again, the gender also signals risk to this. And there's been some attempt to gender neutralize, I guess, these risk situations. But when in some of the research that my colleagues have done with these gender neutral situations, students are like, I don't know what's happening here. I mean, unless the victim is framed as a woman and the man is framed as a perpetrator, it becomes really confusing as to what the situation is even about. And so, because people with minoritized gender identities and non-binary people are at risk for sexual violence, and we need to know what's going on, and that's going to add another barrier. But we haven't really cracked that nut, I guess. So I wanted to give another example of why this may or may not matter, and I would love to hear thoughts from you, and I'll just leave you to read these. This was from the same study, those examples of men talking about their experiences. Anyone has a thought or observation you want to share, feel free to do so. It was real. They were just in these focus groups talking about, have you had experiences as a bystander? What did that look like? What was the situation? So just describing their opportunities and actions. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So kind of based on framework you were just giving us, did you have any female participants saying, well, I didn't feel safe intervening? I didn't feel safe going up to someone who was in need ahead and trying to intervene?
Not in this. These were man identified only focus groups. That has come up in other studies. Absolutely. And not just women. People with a range of minoritized identities. Right. Yeah. And this is, I'm glad you bring that up and happy to talk more about that. And, certainly when we're talking about intervention barriers, that is really important. And really just in the last couple of years, are we looking at that? Yeah. Yeah. So when I say, reflect the commitment to confront the norms that perpetuate violence, this is really what I'm talking about. This person really hit that on the head. And going back to that subjective assessment of looking toward the victim of, is this situation worthy of intervening, is highly problematic for a number of reasons. And so just briefly, I wanted to note, why this matters and point to a couple of other studies. The first looking at benevolent sexism as a correlate to that failure to take intervention responsibility. So people who were higher on scales of benevolent sexism, kind of that paternalism, protection, were more likely to not intervene out of that failure to take intervention responsibility, likely looking at the victim, assessing, is this person worthy of intervening? And we know, we see it in the media, who is worthy of, what kinds of victims make ideal victims. And so that's very problematic for a number of reasons that, again, we're seeing sexism as a barrier, but then this benevolent, which is perceived to be like less bad, right? And then also some research, and this study was done specifically with women, that when in these vignettes, when the potential victim was Black, women were reporting less intent to intervene and that intervention responsibility. And so, and we can look at other research on, racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia, other oppressions, that these are all very much interrelated and are going to be really problematic when bystanders and victims are not of the same identities. And, just knowing the context that we live in, and we all have biases, implicit or explicit. And these aren't talked about. This is changing, but, all campuses, how they do their prevention programming is very different. And this is not always a part of the conversation that, even if it's implicit, right, we're all subjected to the biases we bring. So when we're looking at these situations and thinking, do I intervene or should I? It's highly problematic if we're looking toward the victim to signal cue for, should I even do something about it? So some measurement challenges that I've kind of touched on, so I'll just kind of go over this briefly. Again, assessing action relative to opportunity, but also understanding the amount of opportunity and not making assumptions as far as, if I intervene in this situation, I intervene always in that situation. And looking at bystander frequency, kind of getting to that same note. And often we're just looking at one situation or one, reported experience of my past behavior and assuming that that's how they act in any situation. Moving away from composite scores, which really drives those journal reviewers crazy when we want to look at the situation level, but is so critical when we want to say, like, this is prevention or this is post-assault support. And then understanding the consequences of bystander intervention and not assuming that it's always helpful. And then I'll give some examples of all of these things with kind of what I've been working on most recently. And so in my work, I'm really trying to prioritize this direct confrontation of those at risk for perpetration, because we believe that this aligns with primary prevention and can better tap into whether or not people are intervening because they think this violence is wrong rather than other influences. So my colleagues and I, we pose this as an approach, a new approach to measuring bystander intervention. So I just want to walk through this to kind of illustrate some of this nuanced approach, which we're trying to get at. So each item, this was in a survey done at 2 campuses, and each item was presented to participants in this brief kind of narrative form. So for this one, we had 4 examples, but I'm just going to walk through these 2 here. So have you spoken up when you've heard someone make false statements about sexual assault? We know that rape myth acceptance and victim blaming are precursors to perpetration. So that's why that was chosen. The other one, have you said something to your friend who is taking an intoxicated person back to their room, trying to get more of that gender neutral here. So you can see for this, what we characterized as a low-risk situation, much higher endorsement for having been in this situation in the last year, but still 10%. So not a lot. That's going to have a lot of implications for any follow-up analysis that we can do. And then a much lesser extent, just, under 2.5% in this higher risk situation had been in that position in the last year. So then getting at that number of opportunities, because this really hasn't been examined much, the follow-up question for those people who said, I have been in this situation, we asked, how many times have you had the opportunity to take action in the last year? From 1 to 10 on a drop-down menu, I just collapsed as 5 or more, because for this, I think no one after 2 reported to have more than 2. And then that low-risk situation, we see that more people had more opportunities, which aligns with the literature. People have more opportunities to intervene in these low-risk situations compared to these high-risk situation, which again, has implications for when we're collapsing in a composite score. What are we more likely to have the opportunity to encounter? So then again, a follow-up question, how often have you taken this action? Because again, frequency of intervening really wasn't being looked at. And from an analysis standpoint, this is really beneficial. I mean, we can use this kind of data in longitudinal data. We can do a lot more with it when we're compared to when we're just looking at, one experience or situation outcome. So this ranged from, I've been in this situation, but I've never taken action, high risk situation, no one's reporting that, less or so on this, lower risk situation, to I've taken this action every time. So basically we see for this high risk situation, which very few people had the opportunity to do, most people are intervening, but this is a rare situation. And I think unsurprisingly, but again, no one was really looking at this. When people have more opportunities for this lower risk situation, fewer people are saying, I intervene all the time. And so whether or not this reflects this is just normal conversation, normal banter, I'm kind of acclimated to this kind of behavior, that's what I would probably venture to say. But again, has implications for when we're using those composite scores. We don't understand, we don't get at this level of okay, but they have these interventions more frequently and they're less likely to be doing something in that situation. And then again, a follow-up. This is, and I do want to note though, all these follow-ups, we had very little missing data, which I think is interesting. It has become kind of my experience that when people have experiences in these situations, they want to talk about it. They want to report on it. And so this was kind of towing that line of how much follow-up are we going to have? But we weren't losing anybody. So they hung with us to keep asking about this. So looking at the consequences or outcomes, and again, we were kind of assuming, or people assume, that when people intervene, it's a good thing. Outcomes can range, and I have some other ones, but this is the one that we were really focused on. When you did this, did it prevent further harm? And so I will say that the limitation here is that we weren't asking, because we had 9 potential outcomes. We did not ask all 9 potential outcomes for each behavior that they were performing. So I think when we, how do we make sense of this when people are probably reporting this consequence in relation to their confronting people making false claims about sexual assault? I would say in that situation, there's not a singular person victim in that. So this, is going to take some disentangling and figuring out, how can we ask or maybe we're just, give this is the only outcome we want to know. But we ask other questions as far, did the person get mad or upset with you? Did it hurt your friendship? And those negative consequences were not really reported very frequently, which I think is something that we're not talking about too, is that people may have the perception that this is going to be problematic for a friendship, or that person is going to get mad or upset with them. And we weren't really seeing that happen to great, frequency. Okay. So I did mention that one limitation of, but there are a couple more, of course. The small sample sizes is something that is, was interesting to me. And, because we're asking about this past behavior for the last year, people have to remember it. Of course, people have to be sober to remember, that they had this situation. We know that that's an issue on college campuses for sure. But those small sample sizes really impact our ability to look at differences by demographic, to kind of get at some of those questions about the gender differences. Is it with people with other marginalized identities, to really suss that out? We only looked at 4 situations, but again, in this particular study, we're posing this as, this is an approach. Can you adapt this for your context and situation and population? Absolutely. But what is really important that we were trying to stress, that you can't say that people are preventing violence when your measures include post-assault support. You can't say that people are preventing violence when they're distracting perpetrators or removing potential victims from the situation. And so this was an approach that can be, adapted for a number of situations, but, really at the heart of it was, again, our conclusions are only as strong as our measures, and that we need more research that's directing bystander intervention toward confronting people who are at risk for perpetration. Had some extra slides, but I can stop there. If no one has questions or comments, I'm happy to put those up. But thank you. Thank you for that.
Time for questions. Are there questions online? Okay. Why don't we start with that? And if you wouldn't mind, Key.
Sure.
So what sources of information can you recommend for PI are best reflecting the current data?
So I'm repeating?
Yeah.
Okay. So someone asked about the best resources for maybe most accurate or up-to-date research on bystander intervention. Yeah, I would look to Vicki Banyard's work and Sarah McMahon's work. They are kind of at the forefront of innovations in measurement and really taking all the evidence we have and considering the contextual factors, people's identities. Vicki Banyard, Sarah McMahon.
Go ahead.
No. Thank you, Jill. Great presentation.
Learned so much. I wasn't familiar with the false statements about sexual assault.
Okay.
And I was wondering if you could give some examples.
Sure. Like it's not rape if they're in a relationship or if she was drinking. It's very gendered that way. So false statements, about sexual violence really fall into that category of rape myth acceptance. There are whole scales dedicated to that. So it's largely around men's behavior being excusable because X, Y, and Z, and women being responsible for the violence perpetrated against them because of X, Y, Z. So anything making excuses for it. Yeah. And that, that's a pretty well-established risk factor for perpetration. Yeah. Good question. Annie?
Okay. I'll try and make this brief.
No, it's
I have a 17-year-old son, and I had a conversation with him recently that went something like, if one of your peers was to pressure a female into doing something she didn't want to do, what would be the repercussions? And his response without missing a beat was that person would be socially ostracized. Okay. So I think that's hopeful.
Yeah.
However, when I think about that being maybe the future
Yeah.
of where this is going, I wonder what that means for bystander intervention. If the cultural norms shift and people are maybe a little more guarded about their sexual aggression because it is no longer accepted. What are those opportunities to intervene? How do they change, and how do we measure them? If the norms change in a way that don't make it as unfortunately obvious as it has in my when I miss my son.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, I would like to believe that if the norm, if it becomes less socially acceptable to be sexually aggressive, I guess, I would like to believe that the behavior will stop. But I think you're right, and that it might go underground a little bit first.
So my question is, what's the role of the bystander when we have to maybe be more attuned?
Yeah. I mean, I do think it gets more at those low risk situations, are just like, how do we talk about the targets of our, right? I mean, because a lot of times with young people, it's like, it's happening in a relational context. I mean, it's less likely that it's between strangers. So I think it's, how do we talk about people of all genders? I think broader sexist attitudes and norms, and I think that becomes more challenging, right? It's like the jokes we make, the movies we watch, the music we listen to. So that's what I would say. But hopefully when it's less socially acceptable, I mean, to some extent, I would hope that it is stopping. But yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's interesting, if I can just go on this tangent, like 10 years ago when I told people I study sexual violence, it was like crickets, conversations, over. And now, whether I am with friends or family or people I'm just meeting, or like even climbing, this has come up, and people are like, you know what? I have a son. What would you say? And I love it. So it's interesting that people are becoming more attuned. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Oh, no, go for it.
I had a question on, I think it was measure number 1, identifying opportunities.
Yeah.
I noticed that it went straight from, I've seen this happen within the last year, to this has never happened.
Yeah.
Is there a missing period of time between 1 year and never?
Not that we measured. Yeah. So that was really to get at recency and I guess try to help us move away from that assume. I mean, yeah, I don't know. What is the point? What arguments or what meaning can we make out of someone talking about an experience that happened more than a year ago? But for something, I would say for those lower risk situations, I don't know. I would say there's not much meaning we can make out of it, because if they're happening this frequently for some people, we would hope that someone, or I don't know, that has that experience within the last year. But for some, but I could see the other situation, the more high risk situation, that's impactful, right? If you were to be in that situation, to really be in a situation where you could prevent your friend from sexually assaulting someone, even if that happened 3-4 years ago, that's worthy of capturing. We did not. We just wanted people to be thinking in the last year. Yeah. Jenna, were you? Yeah.
Sorry, you had a question. No, I just wanted to clarify. So your research is for college campuses.
Yeah.
Have you ever considered maybe like high school level doing the same type of research? And the reason why I asked this question was said about the kind of the awkwardness about the relationships with
Yeah.
target of affection.
Yeah.
High schoolers are pretty awkward in that.
Yeah, I just haven't really been in a position. I don't know why I'm less maybe just more squeamish. I think when they're getting younger and you're talking about these, I think it's harder to, so maybe it's just like a logistical thing. I have gone older. I did some research just at a general sample of men 18 to 40. And I was really looking at gender equitable attitudes as a correlate of, we didn't even really call it bystander intervention. It was like men's engagement in anti-violence efforts. And so that was the kind of my only experience with a non-college sample. But yeah, Barbara, you raise a good point. It's like, by the time people get to us and college, they've had 18 years of socialization. And so I think that's another tricky thing with the programming that we haven't really talked much about is, I've talked to practitioners on college campuses, and it's like they want to do bystander training in 30 minutes, 45 minutes. And it's like, yes, and they've had 18 years of being socialized in an environment where this is totally normal behavior. And now we're trying to correct this with the 30-minute module. So, yeah, I think we, not only do we as researchers and programmers, need to be going earlier and earlier.
Thank you.
Yeah. Shannon, do you?
Yeah. So I read your paper. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
So
The one looking at identities and
to the minority group
Yes,
and
okay.
reporting, perceptions of
Yeah.
if you report sexual violence, what is your perception of that response back?
yeah.
I wondered, you reported that you had a subset of people that actually had that experience, right? So what's my perception? And then there was a group that actually had gotten through that.
No, it was just perception.
So the subset that identified as survivors, did that not have like a subset correlate that was like they actually talked to someone?
No, it was just their perception of how their peers would respond.
Was there a question that said, did you speak to a peer?
I don't know.
Because I guess my question is that if there was a subset of survivors, is it possible that some of them are answering from their true lived experience of actually having that conversation versus what they think?
Yeah. Yeah, and we weren't looking at that specifically, but as I've been talking about the findings of that study, I just assume they are talking about it from their personal experience in terms of I disclosed and this happened, or my friend disclosed and this happened. I think it's interesting because, people who I've talked to, it's like, what's the value of talking or asking about perceptions? I think there's a lot of value in that it's probably reflective of past behavior, and it's probably an influence of their disclosure behavior.
So do you think for that group of people, it's less of this is what I think would happen and this is what did happen, or it's this is what did happen, this is what I think would happen in the future? Like, I guess I'm just wondering how that.
I would say that.
Okay.
That's not what we would conclude with the data, but that's the assumption that I would make. So that paper that she's referring to is we were looking at students' perceptions of anticipated peer support. If I disclosed that or really it was just like if someone were to disclose that they had experienced victimization, how would people respond? So, with these different measures. And what we found, we were looking at identities. The more minoritized identities people had, the less favorable, they thought that this would be perceived with, and some intersections with those. And so, that's kind of where some people are going and where the research certainly needs to go. Yeah.
Just to follow up, where was that data collected at a predominantly white institution?
Yes. And
Very diverse.
Yeah. But that PWI designation for sure, but it was a pretty diverse sample. And that came from campus climate data, and I work a lot with campus climate data and various campuses and demographics, and it's, I think that's we need to be looking at that also, how we sample, our populations. Are they representative of our student populations? Because a lot of institutions aren't making that effort, and then we just lose, those voices, and that's problematic for sure. Yeah. So I think, because I've been asked about this too, would we expect that this would look different if these students were, if Black students would feel this way at an HBCU? Again, we didn't have measures of like, do you perceive your peers to be supportive, and are your peers mostly white and you are not white? We didn't have those questions, but I would probably assume that if you are on a campus where most of your peers look like you, I would think that you might perceive your peers to be more supportive. Whereas if you are on a campus where your peers do not look like you, yeah.
I do have a question. Wondering on the prevention side, and I don't know if it's changed, but like when I went to college, like your main bystander intervention might have been when you left the party. And sure, I think you just meant that he's more direct than you are, but I'm just wondering, is that something that's part of the training?
Yeah, it's hard to talk about this because I know all campuses do it differently, and I want to avoid generalizations. I think it is changing. I think campuses and practitioners are becoming more attuned to primary prevention, and it's not just like checking in with your buddy when they leave a party. But when the bystander intervention model for prevention was like first being proposed, it was a lot around party settings. And we know that those are risky situations for sure, and where there's alcohol, but that's not relevant to a lot of people or campuses. It just, so there has been more attempts to like broaden the scope of when we're talking about. Not everyone goes to parties. Not everyone's sexually assaulted at a party. And so, yeah, we need to be more inclusive for sure of people's experiences.
What's next?
I don't know. I'll be honest. I don't know. I guess right now I'm working on this a study with faculty and staff and bystander experiences with sexual harassment in the workplace, which is really interesting. And so developing measures around that are accounting for power differentials and what are the barriers around intervening when, harasser and target are, maybe you report to them or they report to you, or, and people's own identities, social identities. So that's with faculty and staff. I think that's really important to be doing with students too. We're just not, that's not what we're doing right then. So I guess most immediately, but from there, I don't know. What I really want to do, and I've mentioned it, my work with the men 18 to 40 and really bringing it back to gender equitable attitudes, and looking at engagement in anti-violence and like showing up for the events on campus. And this wasn't right on campus, but if I would bring it to a college campus, what I would want to do, just like how are men showing up for anti-violence efforts, not just the bystander, in a situation where risk is already present, but really engaging in, those work that's more broadly targeting violence and sexism. That's what I would love to do. Yeah. Question.
Well, brings us to the top of the hour. Just give one more round of applause.